Goldiblocks. So, why am I talking about something nobody wants to talk about? Mainly because I think right now nobody cares. There's no urgency. There's no wringing of hands and gnashing of teeth over the block size. Why? Right now, there's actually not that much demand. In fact, I would argue perhaps the blocks are too large right now. This is something I started getting a bit worried about a year or so ago. I've been watching the blockchain for many, many years. I watched the fee estimates. This is something I've opined upon many times and wrote fee estimation algorithms in my early days working on Bitcoin. And it seems to me that from all the metrics I've looked at, we've never really gotten another level of retail FOMO adoption since 2017. We've had a few bumps here and there, but mostly it seems like it really is the institutions. And if there is retail adoption happening, a lot of it's going through the ETFs. So point being, there's not been a lot of demand for block space. We've seen, a few fads come and go. There was ordinals and runes. We did have a historically longest period of time ever around the last halving where the fees were exceeding the subsidy for something like 100 or so blocks. And that was good. That was proof that it's theoretically possible to have sustainable fees, at least for some period of time. But we're still a long ways away from what I think is a long-term sustainable fee market. So those of you who were around back in 2017 or so, you should be well aware that the primary thing we were really debating back then was, do we optimize for low cost of validating the system, aka running a full node, or do we optimize for low cost of transacting? And I think it's quite clear which of those two won out. And I think that it was a sensible move forward, but that is not the last question that needs to be answered here. And looking at this over a very long-term perspective, I think there's going to be a question of how do we maximize the number of people who are able to use Bitcoin in a permissionless manner? And doing so, of course, requires block space. But how do we do that without screwing up the potentially fairly delicate balance of powers that we have between the different stakeholders in the ecosystem? This is why the block size debate was so contentious, is because it was also kind of a governance debate. It was a question of who holds the power in the system. So I think from reading reams and reams and reams of block size debate text, this is a quote that really struck me from Greg Maxwell 10 years ago. If the system is too costly, people would be forced to trust third parties rather than independently enforcing the system's rules, aka being able to run your own node. If the blockchain resource usage, and this is important, relative to the available technology is too great, then Bitcoin loses its competitive advantage compared to legacy systems because validation is too costly. Forcing trust back into the system, this is not what we want. And if capacity is too low and our methods of transacting too inefficient, then access to the chain for dispute resolution, potentially from second layers and other types of ecosystems that are anchored into Bitcoin, that will be too costly. Once again, pushing trust back into the system. So this is why I've entitled this talk Goldiblocks, is because I really think that what Greg Maxwell pointed out is that this isn't just a one-way problem. It is kind of a balancing act. You don't want cost to be too low. You don't want cost to be too high. And that is why I think all of the previous block size debates were flawed. I think block size is the wrong question. We've all been going around, or at least a number of years ago, saying, what should the block size be? But I think that just trying to pull some static number out of a hat is always going to be wrong. I think we have to ask more nuanced questions, which is, how do we incentivize the efficient usage of block space? Which means, of course, that it can't be too cheap. But how do we incentivize development of other layers? This is also where fee pressure comes in and is incentivizing people to be more efficient. But how do we avoid the tragedy of the commons, which is, block space is a common resource. It is something that we all have to share. So if it's too cheap, you can expect people are going to be putting all their JPEGs into the blockchain. On the other hand, how do we take advantage of technological growth? And what that really means is we understand that technology is deflationary. A given type of computational resource is basically guaranteed to become cheaper over the long run, over many years. And then finally, how do we sustain, in particular, the thermodynamic security of the system? And I think the answer to all of this is fees. And of course, fees are a consequence of block space supply and demand. And so since we've mostly only been talking about supply, at least in the block size debate, I think that the demand component is something that was generally overlooked. And also, if you've been around for long enough, then you shouldn't be too surprised by this. This meme comes up in many different areas of society, but it's true for block space as well. So we've had times where there were very high fees, and that incentivized people to use less block space or to look for alternative solutions. Maybe those were layer twos, maybe those were completely other networks. Maybe they were going back to using fiat and TradFi networks. But then if we successfully increase the efficiency of block space, then there will be more block space available, which then creates low fees. Those low fees result in people putting their JPEGs into the blockchain. And then these inefficient uses of block space once again create high fees. And I think that this is a cycle that we should pretty much expect to continue in perpetuity if nothing changes. So what's best for miners? And I'll say this is not by any means a highly accurate model. I'm just trying to portray the way that fees work. And so on the left, this orange this is kind of a 1 megabyte block limit, and then red is 10 megabyte blocks, and then green is 100 megabyte blocks. And the only point that I'm really trying to convey here is that as long as the demand, which is on the x-axis here, is less than the available supply, then you can expect that the fees that people are paying, the fees that are collected by miners, are only going to grow linearly because people are only going to pay the minimum relay fee, which for a very, very long time has been 1 Satoshi per virtual byte. But as soon as the demand exceeds the supply of block space, all of a sudden you have a fee market. You have an auction for a limited amount of block space, and fees essentially go exponential. So if we want to be acting and operating in that higher level, robust fee market space, if we want to maximize the thermodynamic security by getting miners more fees, that means blocks have to be full. There has to be an ongoing auction for block space so that the block space is only used with the most valuable economic uses, whatever that may be. If people are willing to pay for it, that means that they find it economically valuable. So stated differently, I think that for long-term thermodynamic security, it is desirable that the supply of block space be strictly less than the demand for block space. Of course, predicting the future is very difficult. What will the demand be? As I mentioned earlier, it's cyclical. You cannot possibly predict all the different variables that will affect demand. So when I look back upon a lot of the Bitcoin improvement proposals for block space and block size, I think they were flawed. They tended only to look at increasing the block size. A lot of them were just pulling numbers out of a hat. These people were mostly considering sort of short-term fixes, just kick the can down the road, and then we'll argue about the block size later when it becomes an issue again. And none of these BIPs really took economics into account. The way that they increased block size, it was generally just let some period of time go by and then double, triple, quadruple, just do something to increase the block size more because we expect that it'll be cheaper from a resource standpoint, and we should be able to handle it. And so the result of that is that you're basically going to be aborting any fee market that may develop at any point in time because you're going to just flood so much supply into the market of block space. And also, some of these BIPs were concerning because they actually gave the miners the power to potentially game the block size itself, which I think is not something that we want to do. We don't really want to disrupt any of the current balance of power in the system. And then finally, BIP 103, I think, was the only one that actually concerned itself with safety parameters from a node operator point of view. And BIP 103 was Peter Woola's bandwidth increase base. I think it was something like 17% per year increase on the block size. So then we look out upon the rest of the ecosystem. There's not a ton of networks out there that automatically adjust their block size or even have ways to easily adjust it. When I was looking out, I saw that Dash essentially has a sort of master node voting mechanism. Ethereum in the proof of work phase was mainly based upon miners voting on the gas limits, and they were able to increase it if they agreed to do so. Then we have EIP 1559, which is a little bit dynamic in the sense that it has a target, and then it kind of adjusts the base fee requirements for transactions up and down, depending upon if the previous block was above or below the target. And then that is allowed to go up to basically double of the target of gas. I think that the validators can still vote on increasing that max, but don't hold me to it. Finally, Monero. Monero was particularly interesting because it is highly dynamic. And it's basically, it allows miners to increase the block size essentially if they take a penalty on the subsidy, which means that they have to increase the minimum transaction fee. How does that work? More specifically, with Monero, it looks at the median block size of the previous 100 blocks. And if that's more than 60 kilobytes, then it allows you to create a new block that's larger than that median block size. And then there's basically a quadratic penalty formula that allows you to go up to as much as double the block size. But the higher you go, the more penalty the miners have to take on the subsidy, which means they have to require higher transaction fees to make up to offset that cost. So small increase is a small penalty. Large increase is a much larger penalty. And then if you try to do more than double, the block is invalid. And we can look at some charts. So here is in the red, the block size, and in the orange, the total fees. Of course, 2017, 2018 was a bit off the charts. So we probably need to zoom in a bit more to see what is some of the more recent periods looks like. And you can see it tends to adjust pretty well. Block size goes up, fees go up, block size goes down, fees go down. But then you zoom in even more, and like one of the issues that I have with this is because it's this sliding window of just the past 100 blocks, then if you essentially level out, if the block size gets to be nearly flat, then the fee or the penalty goes down, therefore the fees go down again. So it doesn't really do a great job at sustaining fees. It does a good job at buffering itself against the volatility and requiring people to pay more if we're doing a sudden increase in the block size. So I think a little bit could be learned from this. So the question that I have is, can we adjust the supply of block space in response to demand? And this is a really hard problem. Preferably, we would be able to just look at the mempool and say, like, how much mempool backlog is there and what are the fees in the mempool and so on and so forth. But obviously, you can't have consensus rules based upon the mempool. It's just not going to work because there is no the mempool. It's not a guaranteed thing. Then, as I said earlier, we have to be really careful to not change the game theory of the system, to not let miners potentially screw with it even more. As we've already had several talks earlier that we're talking about some of the terrible things that adversarial miners could already do today if they really wanted to. And I think we should avoid getting into that situation. And then finally, we don't want sort of one-off edge cases to potentially create more volatility or be able to affect any sort of algorithm that we have here. So if we're going to implement a dynamic algorithm, I think we should learn from our own mistakes, from other people's mistakes, especially look at difficulty adjustment algorithms. I think there's a number of parallels here. We also had yesterday some talks about how there were bugs in Bitcoin's difficulty adjustment algorithm. So we need to understand any of these dynamic adjustment algorithms need to be extremely well vetted. Even having off by one bugs, having edge case bugs can actually create potentially catastrophic circumstances if someone decides to game them adversarially. We can also look at the history of Bitcoin Cash and their dynamic adjustment algorithms for difficulty, and I think they're on like the third iteration. And I think the really high level issue of the first two is basically they were trying to be too quick to adjust, and they discovered that the miners discovered that that created an advantage for them to basically go in and mine Bitcoin Cash for a little while, come back out, mine Bitcoin, and go back and forth and really ping pong it around. So you do have to realize that miners are going to do whatever they find is best for them, not necessarily what you think is best for the network. So if we're looking at the Bitcoin block size, this is when I started asking myself, is it even possible? Like, is there data in the blockchain that we can use to try to figure out what the demand for block space is? So if we look at the block weight versus the fees, one thing I think should be pretty clear is that as long as the actual block weight used is less than the maximum, like I said earlier, then fees are going to be pretty low. There's not going to be much contention for block space. There's not really going to be an auction market. So if we zoom in a bit more, this is also looking, let's see, the first one is transaction fees per byte. This is transaction fees per block weight. As you can see, there's not really much difference between the two. But once again, we see, if we zoom in even more, when the blocks are not full, fees are practically zero, that 1 Satoshi per virtual byte. But then something changed in 2023, and I think this is around when like ordinals and people starting to put their JPEGs, their NFTs, their other tokens and stuff into the blockchain. This is when we really started using up all of the available block space, even when sometimes the fees would stay really low. So maybe this is going to change. You can see it starts to drop off again very recently. Maybe that was a fad that is over. I don't think that we can continue expecting or assuming that blocks will not be full. And even if blocks are full, there will be times where the fees are really low just because there are now other use cases out there where people are willing to essentially bid the minimum relay amount and hope that they can use block space for some non-financial good. What if we look at block size versus mempool, which is basically the sort of queued up demand for block space? And this is kind of what I was getting at, is these days we can't really expect that there's going to be a correlation between the two. As a result, I don't really see how looking at the block size, at the previous blocks and their size, is going to really allow us to have any sort of dynamic change that would allow us to create a sustainable fee market. But if we look at, here's the mempool, basically the Bitcoin and mempool versus the Bitcoin blocks transaction fees, we can see there's a pretty good correlation between the two, which should be somewhat obvious, right? Because the mempool is basically just what's waiting to get into blocks. So I think if we're looking at trying to create some sort of algorithm, it really needs to be focused on what are the fees that are being collected by the miners, not what is the actual size of the blocks that are being created by the miners. So if we're doing that, how can we do it without changing the game theory? I think most people would agree that we don't want to just let the miners vote on the block size. Then we have to ask ourselves, can we somehow do it based upon attributes of recent blocks and transactions? And the problem with that, of course, is that miners can stuff their blocks with whatever they want, and they're just paying themselves their own fees. So that's not very good game theory. Can we fix it? I think possibly. And I'll be interested in speaking with miners after this to see what they think, because I'm not a miner. I don't know what other side effects this may have to your own business model or whatever. But if we don't want miners to be able to stuff their own blocks and potentially manipulate any sort of dynamic block size algorithm, then I think we essentially need to have them pay forward the Coinbase outputs. Whether this is the subsidy and the fees or just the fees, I don't know that it really matters. But I think that this should be possible if we basically require those fees to be sent to some future miner with sort of an anyone can spend, check lock time, verify, some point in the future, so that you're essentially paying a random miner, and this would ensure that any fees that are going into the block are getting collected in the future, and you're going to be collecting the fees from some miner at some point in the past. So this is kind of hand wavy, but I've just been doing a little bit of modeling and was trying to figure out what are the different variables that you might want to put into a dynamic block size algorithm. And I think that the first thing you look at is, well, are the blocks sufficiently empty? If so, that means there's really no demand whatsoever. Like, we don't even have people putting the JPEGs in the blockchain. And if so, I would say look at how much weight was left over and just decrease the maximum size by that amount, and keep ratcheting it down until we see that there's some sort of market happening. If the blocks are full, then I think you want to, similar to the difficulty adjustment algorithm, basically create epochs of maybe 1,000, 2,000 blocks or so. I wouldn't go less than 1,000 blocks, and that's just due to the inherent volatility, the nature of the demand for block space. There are both daily and weekly cycles of demand for block space on a regular basis, and this also gets rid of some of the other volatility issues if you're trying to adjust things too quickly. And basically look at the trend between the previous period and the current period. And these numbers might not make much sense yet, but if the current period is less than 10 sats per weight unit, then maybe bring down the block size by just a little bit. If it's larger than that, then I would recommend using some sort of quadratic formula to adjust the actual block size, basically between like half and 2x. And the reason that I think a quadratic formula makes sense is because of that, one of the first charts that I showed, where the fees don't go up linearly. Like, once you have an actual auction market for block space, the fees don't go up linearly to demand. They really go up exponentially. So a little bit more demand actually causes the fees to get jacked up significantly. And so we should understand that and adjust with that understanding. And then finally, you want to have some floor and ceiling safety limits and sanity checks. And what are those? That's up for debate. I'll have recommendations. So this is how I came to the conclusion that the 10 sats per weight unit is a pretty good indicator. This is essentially, I chunked up into 1,000 block segments over the past several years and saw that once we were well above the 10 Satoshi per weight unit in fees, those were the times when there was actual decent mempool backlog. There were people actually having to bid for block space. So this is the closest thing that I've been able to come to so far for an approximation of figuring out when there's real demand for block space that we might then be able to use to input into some sort of adjustment. Now, what about the node operators? We don't want to disenfranchise them either. And so, this is one of the other projects I've been doing for many years, is checking, how quickly does a node sync? And basically, the right side is the older node versions, and as you go to the left, it gets newer and newer. And we see that the node software is getting more and more performant, and that is good. We don't want to disrupt that. This is another way to kind of visualize that is, over time, over each release, is it getting faster, slower? In general, we're kind of treading water. But as you know, the blockchain only gets larger and larger, so we want to keep being able to improve the performance of node syncing and validation, and we don't want this chart to go up and to the right, because that means it's getting too expensive for people to operate their full nodes. I've also done some research into peer bandwidth. And this is one of the more disconcerting things about the network. I think this is mostly a result of the fact that people are running their nodes at home on residential broadband connections, which are almost always asymmetric. Your upstream is almost always incredibly tiny compared to your downstream. And so it seems like most of the nodes out there have less than like 30 or so megabits per second upstream. So we know that there are a number of different laws when it comes to technological advancement and progression. Everyone's familiar with Moore's law, but most other computing resources have their own type of law, whether that's around bandwidth, disk space, so on and so forth. And I'm just putting this here because these are potential ideas, things to keep in mind if we're looking at what should various sanity checks be. And I think James O'Byrne is going to have some discussion into some of these edge cases, and hopefully that will be able to then be integrated into my thoughts process as well. So here is an example of download, downstream bandwidth over the years. As we can see, that's increasing a lot. But like I said, upstream is really what I'm more concerned about. There's not a lot of good data out there. This is from Ookla. And what you'll notice is from 2021 to 2022, I think they somehow significantly changed how they were actually measuring upstream bandwidth. And they seem to have wanted to hide this. Like I had to go back on the web archive in order to find some of these old charts. But suffice to say, if you look at the columns, which are showing the delta year over year, it looks like 10, 15, 20% per year increase in overall global upstream bandwidth. I'm sure that's not evenly distributed, but that's the nature of technology. So, like I said, we want sanity checks on the floor and the ceiling. If we were going to implement some sort of hard ceiling sanity check within the context of a dynamic block size algorithm, currently my suggestion would be upstream bandwidth. And so it would be something as simple as saying, take 50,000 block epoch, which is about a year, and every 50,000 blocks, increase the max cap by 10, 15, 20%, depending on what people think is safe. What is safe? This is what it would look like if we started implementing that algorithm as the hard cap. And like I said, this is the super hard cap. There would be another dynamic lower cap that would be based upon the economics and the demand for block space. But if we did 20% per year, then by 2040, we would have 15x'd the total block weight. And if we went with the more conservative 10% per year, then by 2040, it would be probably around 15, 16 million weight units. So like 4x of the current max block weight. And then, of course, there's a question of, do we hard fork or we soft fork? It seems like with sufficient creativity, almost anything can be soft forked. Hat tip to Jeremy Rubin for letting me know that you could do a block size increase if you just changed the Merkle root so that we have a new Merkle root in the Coinbase output that you would commit all the transactions to. The downside to that is that it would be even more of a blinding soft fork than the SegWit soft fork was. The SegWit soft fork only blinded nodes to SegWit transactions. They were still able to see non-SegWit transactions. A block size soft fork would blind legacy nodes to all transactions other than the Coinbase transactions. They would only see the Coinbase transaction in the block. They would still see other transactions in the mempool. They just wouldn't see them getting confirmed. This is, of course, always going to be one of the most contentious things to talk about, whether hard fork or soft fork is worth it, from a design space and sort of cleanliness and technical debt perspective. A hard fork is cleaner, but that I'm sure will be up for debate. Personally, I do think hard forks are feasible. on a long enough time frame. And I've done some research into this, into node operators and how long they tend to run their node versions for. So here you can see, because a new version of Bitcoin Core comes out about every 6 months, so every 25 weeks on this chart. And you can see after about 3 years, pretty much everybody has upgraded their node. Different way of visualizing that. How many weeks does it take for 95% of Bitcoin Core nodes to stop running their current release version? And we can see usually that's less than 2 years, but sometimes it's getting up to the 3-year mark. So I would say like a hard fork, if it's scheduled more than 3 or 4 years in the future, and of course, non-contentious or not too contentious, that it should be feasible to actually pull that off without creating a chain split. But to recap, this is a complex, multifaceted topic, and there's a lot of stakeholders who have their own interests. And my main thing is that I don't think anyone can choose the right block size, because I think this is a very dynamic market and no one can predict what the demand for block space will be. And as we continue building out more things on top of Bitcoin, the demand itself on the main chain will fluctuate. So we have to ask ourselves, what are we really trying to do here? What are we trying to optimize for? What are the things that we're trying to keep from breaking? What do we consider to be like a healthy state of the network? How do we support thermodynamic security? But how do we also continue to incentivize innovation on other layers? Like there needs to be some cost that drives people to find efficiencies by developing on other layers. But how do we also do this while remaining constrained within safety limits so that we don't disenfranchise node operators? And how do we still allow ourselves to take advantage of technological advancement? I think not doing so is a real foot gun. This is basically, free throughput that is given to us by an extremely diverse ecosystem of engineers and hardware developers and so on and so forth. And to just kind of throw that out the window, I think is pretty ridiculous. And then finally, and possibly controversially, I think that hard forks on a long enough time scale are probably safe. So, there's a few major things that are debatable and I think we should have conversations about. But I think in order to do something like this, you have to fix the block stuffing problem by changing how the Coinbase outputs are locked. Some sort of dynamic weekly or possibly longer adjustment algorithm that isn't too volatile could be implemented. And then, of course, hard floor and ceiling based upon various safety limits. And if you're going to do a hard fork, then I think it needs to be done fairly far in the future so that everyone is on the same page with their software. So looking forward to discussing this with all of the stakeholders involved. And like I said, this is not me playing Chicken Little and saying the sky is falling and we need to do something right now. This is me looking out really, really far in the future and saying there's a number of long-term problems that we need solutions for. And I think that the solutions are out there. We just need to figure out how to get on the same page about them. Thank you.